Nobody believed Wren at first. That was the part her grandmother would never forgive herself for. Not the years that passed, not the silences that calcified in the rooms of that old house. Not even the night everything finally broke open in a way that could not be undone. What Lenora could not let go of was the simple, devastating fact that a 7-year-old child had been telling the truth all along, and the adults in her life had been too consumed by their own grief to hear it. But to understand what Wren knew, you have to understand what came before her. You have to understand the house on Ember Creek Road, the way it sat at the far edge of a property that had once been farmland, and now was just silence and overgrown grass, and the occasional deer moving through the fog at dawn. You have to understand the weight that lived inside that house long before Wren was born. And you have to understand a cat named Sable, who arrived the same autumn that everything else began to fall apart, and who stayed for reasons that no one could explain using words that felt sufficient. This is not a story about a cat who is loyal. Loyalty is too small a word for what happened. This is a story about a child who was drowning in plain sight, about a family fractured along fault lines no one wanted to name, about the way grief can live in a place the way cold lives in stone, and about the impossible, unnerving, quietly miraculous way that a small black cat with amber eyes became the only witness to a truth that would take years to fully surface. By the time it did, Wren was no longer the silent little girl who hid under her bed when storms came. She was something else entirely. And Sable was gone. And what remained in the space between those two facts was something Lenora carried every day for the rest of her life, like a stone held in both hands, too heavy to put down, too precious to ever set aside. But we begin where it began. Not with the cat. Not yet. We begin with the storm. The first time Wren was found under the bed during a storm, she was 4 years old. It was June. A thunderstorm had swept in fast off the ridge to the west, a kind of storm that arrives sideways, that leans into the windows and makes old houses groan at their joints. Her mother, Adeline, had been downstairs in the kitchen when the thunder cracked, and she had called up for Wren and gotten no answer. And when she climbed the stairs and found the room empty, she had felt the particular cold panic that belongs only to parents of young children in large houses. She found Wren pressed back against the far wall under the iron frame of the bed, knees drawn up, arms wrapped tight around herself, not crying, not making any sound at all, just still, just watching the window with her pale gray eyes, like she was waiting for something to break through the glass. Adeline got down on the floor and coaxed her out and held her and said all the things a mother says. It is just noise. It cannot hurt you. It is only weather. And Wren had let herself be held, but she had not fully relaxed, and she had kept her eyes on the window until the storm moved on and the room went quiet again. It was strange, Adeline thought, but children were afraid of storms. It was one of the ordinary fears, like dogs and the dark and the sound of sirens. She didn't ask Wren what specifically frightened her. She assumed she knew. She was wrong. The cat appeared 8 months later, in the middle of February, when the world outside was gray and flat, and the cold had settled so deep into the fields that the ground had become like iron underfoot. Adeline found it on the front porch. It was sitting on the top step, looking at the door with the quiet expectation of an animal that had already decided it lived there and was simply waiting for the humans inside to catch up. It was entirely black, which was the first thing she noticed. Not dark gray, not dark brown. Black the way ink is black, the kind of black that holds light inside it and gives nothing back. It had amber eyes the color of old honey, and they were very still and very direct. There was no nervous flick of the gaze, no crouching uncertainty. It simply watched her. She looked at it for a long moment. She was not a cat person. She had never thought of herself as an animal person of any kind. Their dog, A quiet old golden retriever named Edmund had died the previous spring, and the house had felt different since then, emptier in the corners, slower in the mornings, and she had not been ready to consider anything else. But the cold was significant that day, and the cat did not look like a cat with anywhere to be, so she opened the door. It walked in without hesitation. Edmund's old water bowl was still in the corner of the kitchen. Adeline watched the cat find it without being shown, lower its head, and drink from it as though this were an arrangement already established. Then it walked through the kitchen, through the hall, up the stairs without pausing, and found Wren. Adeline heard the sound from the landing, a small laugh. The kind of laugh a child produces when something delights them so completely that the sound comes out before they've decided to let it. She climbed the rest of the stairs and stood in the doorway of Wren's room and watched her daughter sit cross-legged on the rug with a black cat in her lap, running her fingers through the fur along the cat's spine, saying something in a low voice that Adeline couldn't make out. She had expected Wren to ask if they could keep it. Wren did not ask. She looked up at her mother with those pale gray eyes and said, with the calm certainty of someone stating a fact already agreed upon, that his name was Sable. Not a question, not a suggestion, a fact. Adeline stood there in the doorway for a moment, something turning slowly in her chest that she could not name. Then she went back downstairs to find something the cat could eat. Life in the house on Ember Creek Road had not been simple for a long time. It had once been, or at least it had the memory of simplicity layered through it the way old paint is layered through old walls. Adeline had grown up in this house. Her mother, Lenora, had raised her here after the death of Adeline's father when Adeline was 12. The house had absorbed that grief and gone on. Lenora was a woman who went on. It was her defining quality, and also, in ways that would take decades to surface, one of her most costly habits. Adeline had left at 18, traveled, trained as a nurse, met a man named Callum in a city 3 states away, married him, got pregnant with Wren, and come back to the house on Ember Creek Road when Wren was 2 years old, because something in Callum had shifted, the way a foundation shifts, and by the time she understood the shift was permanent, she needed the safety of the house she had grown up in. Callum was not a bad man. That was the part Adeline had the hardest time explaining to anyone, including herself. He was not unkind. He was not dangerous. He had simply gone somewhere that she couldn't reach, somewhere interior and locked, and had stayed there for longer and longer stretches, until one day she had looked across the kitchen table at him and understood with terrible clarity that the man she loved was not there anymore, and had not been for longer than she wanted to admit. He left in January. Wren had just turned 3. She remembered the sound of his car on the gravel. She remembered standing at the window in the upstairs hall, Wren asleep in her room, watching the headlights turn out of the drive. She remembered the exact quality of that silence, the way it felt like standing on a bridge after the last train has passed through, still, vibrating somewhere too deep to hear. Wren never asked where her father had gone. That was the thing that frightened Adeline more than anything else. The questions that didn't come. Lenora came to stay 3 days after Callum left and never quite left herself, settling back into the rhythms of the house with the ease of a woman returning to a language she had never stopped dreaming in. She was in her late 60s then, strong, organized, practical in the particular way of women who have learned that practicality is a form of survival. She cooked and cleaned and managed the household with efficient, quiet love, and she watched her daughter grieve and watched her granddaughter not grieve and kept her thoughts to herself. It was into this house, carrying this particular weight, that Sable arrived. The first storm after Sable came was in March, a late winter storm, wet and heavy, the kind that pressed against the windows like something wanting in. Adeline was in the kitchen when she heard the first roll of thunder, distant enough to still be meaningless. She began moving through her familiar ritual of mild bracing, closing the windows at the back of the house that she'd cracked for the brief warmth of the afternoon. She had just reached the bottom of the stairs when she heard Sable, not a cry, not the sound a frightened animal makes. It was a different sound entirely. A low, sustained sound, almost vibratory, not quite a meow. The kind of sound that makes you stop and listen, not because it is loud, but because something in it requests your attention in a way that bypasses ordinary understanding. She followed the sound upstairs. Sable was already in Wren's room. The lamp was still on, throwing warm light across the rug and the scattered stuffed animals and the small bookcase with its disordered row of picture books. Wren was sitting up in bed, not yet frightened, not yet hiding, but with the look of a child who has heard something and is waiting to hear it again. And Sable was on the bed beside her, not curled at her feet the way cats sleep, sitting upright, close to her left side, one paw placed very deliberately on her knee. That sound still coming from somewhere inside him, low and continuous, like a signal being sent. The thunder rolled again, closer. Wren's shoulders came up, and Sable turned his head very slightly toward the window, then back to Wren, and pressed his paw more firmly against her knee. And the sound changed, lower, steadier. Adeline watched from the doorway. Wren did not go under the bed that night. She sat in the pool of lamplight, with her hand over the cat's paw and her eyes on his face. And something in her breathing changed. Some deep involuntary tightening that usually came with the thunder stayed loose this time, stayed open. And when the storm moved over the house in full, and the windows rattled, and the light outside went white and sharp, Wren flinched but didn't disappear. She stayed. She pressed her fingers into Sable's fur and stayed. Adeline told Lenora about it the next morning over coffee. She described the sound the cat had made, the way he had placed his paw on Wren's knee, the steadiness of his presence, the way Wren had remained in bed instead of hiding. Lenora had listened with her hands wrapped around her mug and her expression neutral in the way it became when she was thinking something she hadn't decided to say. It was a cat, she finally said. Animals sense weather. Adeline nodded. She stirred her coffee. She did not say what she was actually thinking, which was that she had never seen an animal do what Sable had done. She had never seen a cat use sound and touch with that particular deliberateness, as though it had assessed the situation and made a calculated choice. She did not say it. She filed it away, but she watched. By summer, the pattern was undeniable. It did not matter what kind of storm was coming. It did not matter whether the sky was clear an hour before. Sable always knew. He would stop whatever he was doing, mid-movement, mid-grooming, mid-sleep, with a precision that eventually began to make Adeline's skin tighten. He would move through the house, no hurry, no apparent agitation, just purpose. And he would find Wren. He always found Wren. He would settle beside her, make that sound, place himself close enough that she could feel his warmth, and he would wait. At first, Adeline timed it. She was a nurse. She was inclined toward data when things unsettled her. She began noting when Sable first showed the behavior and when the storm actually arrived. Once it was 40 minutes ahead. Once it was nearly an hour. The average, over the course of 8 observations that summer, was 32 minutes. 32 minutes before any change in the sky that a person could see. Before any change in the air that a person could feel. Before any notification from any weather application on her phone. She showed the notes to Lenara, who read them twice and set them down on the kitchen table and said, with a careful precision that meant she was choosing her words, that there were animals that sensed barometric changes. That some cats were particularly sensitive to pressure shifts. That this was not unheard of. All of which was true. Adeline knew it was true. But she also knew that when she watched Sable cross the house toward Wren's room with that unhurried, Absolute certainty. It did not feel like barometric sensitivity. It felt like intention. It felt like a specific choice made for a specific reason, as though the cat understood not just that a storm was coming, but that a particular child in a particular room with a particular kind of fear needed something that no human in the house had yet figured out how to give her. She did not write that in the notes. She wasn't sure how to write it, but she thought it. What she did not know, what she would not understand for 2 more years, was what Wren was actually afraid of. She thought she knew. She had constructed an explanation that felt reasonable and sufficient. Wren had been 2 years old when Callum left, and there had been a significant argument the night before he went, in the kitchen late, and it had been accompanied by a storm. Adeline barely remembered the storm. She remembered the argument. She remembered Wren's door opening at the top of the stairs, and a small silhouette standing there, and her own voice going suddenly quiet, and the feeling of something breaking that she had tried, for years, to walk back from. She had assumed the storm, and the fracture had fused in Wren's young mind into a single catastrophic memory. That the thunder, every subsequent time, conjured the fear of things breaking apart. This was not wrong, but it was not complete, and the incompleteness of it was where all the hidden weight lived. Lenora knew. She had known for a while, the way people who carry secrets know, with the particular silence of someone who has made an internal bargain about what the truth would cost. But it was summer, and Wren was doing better, and Sable was there, and the house had a certain warmth to it that Lenora was unwilling to disturb. So she kept the bargain. For a while longer. Wren turned 5 in September. There was a small party, just the 3 of them and 2 of Wren's friends from the town, and it was a good day, one of the days that felt whole. Wren wore a red dress and ate too much cake and fell asleep before 8, with Sable curled in the curve of her knees like a comma, like a pause, like something marking a place in a sentence that wasn't finished yet. Adeline sat in the kitchen with Lenora after the children had left and the dishes were done, and they drank tea, and Lenora said, with the studied casualness of someone who had rehearsed the entrance to something difficult, that she had heard from Callum. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. He was doing better, Lenora said. He had been working with someone. He wanted to know how Wren was. Adeline held her mug with both hands and looked at the table. She asked how long Lenora had been in contact with him. Lenora told her. It was not a brief amount of time. The argument that followed was not loud. That was a feature of arguments in this house, a kind of coded restraint that had been passed down through the women who lived here. This particular way of fighting quietly that was, in some ways, more corrosive than shouting because it left nothing released. The anger just settled back down into the stone of the place. Adeline went upstairs. She did not go to her own room. She went to Wren's doorway and stood there for a long time in the dark, watching the small shape of her daughter and the darker shape of the cat, listening to their breathing. She thought about what it meant that Lenora had been keeping this. She thought about all the things this house had absorbed without comment. She thought about the way grief and loyalty can look almost identical from certain angles, and how dangerous that resemblance is. She did not sleep well that night, and when she finally did sleep, the dream that came was not a story. It was a sound. The sound of thunder, and under it, something that might have been a door closing, or might have been a voice going suddenly silent. She woke before dawn. The house was still. Sable was sitting on the end of her bed, watching her with those amber eyes, and she had the strangest sensation that he had been there for some time. October brought harder weather. The storms of October in that part of the country were serious things. They came with intention, with cold embedded inside the rain, with wind that moved through the trees like something looking for a weakness in the structure of the world. The leaves were off the hardwoods by mid-month, and the fields had gone to the pale gold of exhaustion, and the sky on storm days sat low and heavy, pressing down. Wren had started school that year. Kindergarten at the elementary school in town, a 20-minute drive down the ridge road. She went quietly and came home quietly, and did not, as far as Adeline could tell, make close friends, but she seemed to endure it. She was a child who observed. She watched other children with the careful attention of someone taking notes, and sometimes she asked questions that surprised the adults around her, specific and sideways questions, questions that reached at something from an unexpected angle. She asked her teacher once, according to the teacher who later mentioned it to Adeline, whether cats were allowed to visit the school. The teacher had said no. Wren had nodded and said that she understood that her cat came to her when she needed him, and that she would try to need him only at home. The teacher had thought it was sweet. She had no context for it. Adeline, when she heard this, felt something cold move through her that she filed under concern and kept moving. At home, Sable continued. His routine had become so established that it was easy to stop seeing it clearly, the way things do when they become part of the texture of ordinary days. Adeline would have to remind herself sometimes to actually watch what was happening, to see it fresh, and when she did, it still unsettled her. He never missed. He never arrived after the storm had already started. He never panicked, never paced, never exhibited the agitated behavior that animals in weather distress usually showed. He simply arrived, settled, stayed. He sat with Wren through rain and lightning and the long rolling percussion of thunder, his paw on her knee or his body pressed to her side. His amber eyes often pointed toward the window with an expression that, if it had been on a human face, Adeline would have called watchful, like he was watching something she couldn't see. There was an October storm, mid-month, that arrived on a school day. Wren was home with a cold, bundled on the couch with a blanket and a glass of water and a book she was too tired to actually read. Sable was in his usual spot, which on the couch was the cushion immediately to her left, close enough to touch. Lenora was upstairs. Adeline was in the kitchen. The storm came in from the west, and the room went dark, and the first real crack of thunder shook the windows in a way that was felt in the chest. Adeline came out of the kitchen, expecting to find Wren under a blanket or possibly off the couch. Instead, she found her daughter sitting up, looking at the window, with Sable standing on the cushion beside her. Not sitting, standing, his entire body facing the window, every line of him alert and directed, his tail very still. And Wren was watching him. Not the window. Him. She had one hand on his back, light, not holding, just resting, and her face was not frightened. It was something else. It was focused. It was the face of a child reading something that was being written in real time. Adeline stood in the doorway and did not speak. The thunder rolled again, longer this time, filling the room. The windows went white with lightning. Sable did not flinch. He stayed fully upright and facing the window, and his tail moved once, a slow sweep, and then was still again. Wren said, in a voice so quiet it was almost swallowed by the rain, that he was listening. Adeline asked her what he was listening to. Wren looked at her mother then. Gray eyes, steady, unself-conscious, in the way that very young children are before the world teaches them to be cautious with their perceptions. She said she didn't know exactly, but that he listened every time, and that she thought he was listening for the thing that came before the noise. Then she turned back to the window, her hand still resting on Sable's back, and they watched the storm together in that particular shared silence that Adeline did not have words for, and would think about at odd moments for years. November. Colin called. Adeline answered because she happened to be the one who picked up the phone, and the fraction of a second in which she considered not answering passed before the next ring could save her. His voice was different. Not dramatically different, not unrecognizable, but there was something in it that had not been there before. A kind of settledness, a texture of presence, as though the person speaking had decided to fully occupy the voice rather than float somewhere behind it. He asked about Ren. She told him Ren was well. She told him about school. She kept her voice level and informative in the way you do when you are performing the routine of civil exchange while something larger moves beneath the floor. He asked if he could see her. The silence that followed was not long. It only felt long. She said she would think about it. She put the phone down and stood in the kitchen for a moment without moving. Then she went to find Ren, which was what she did when she needed to put herself back together, because something about her daughter's presence worked on her the way pressure works on something, structural, stabilizing, necessary. She found her in the backyard with Sable, despite the cold. Ren was sitting on the back porch step in her coat and hat, and Sable was beside her, both of them looking out at the field that ran to the tree line. They were not doing anything, just sitting, just looking at the world together. Adeline sat down on the step behind them and put her arms around Ren from behind and pressed her face into the top of her daughter's hatted head and breathed. Ren leaned back into her. Sable did not look back at them. He kept his amber eyes on the tree line, patient as old stone. She did not tell Ren about the call. She was not sure how to begin. What she did not know, what she would not know until much later, was that in those weeks, something had already shifted in Ren. Something that had been living too deep to surface was beginning its long, slow movement toward light. And Sable was part of that movement, had been part of it since February, had been doing something in those storms that was not only comfort. He had been teaching her something. Or perhaps not teaching, accompanying. Being the still point around which she had begun, very slowly, to reorganize the thing she carried. But the thing itself was still underground, still unnamed. And the winter ahead would be the winter that named it. The first real snow came in December, not a storm exactly. A silence that descended and covered everything and changed the quality of the world, the way snow does. The house went quiet in a different way. Footsteps became sounds. Distance became visible. Ren loved snow in a way she did not love most things. She moved through it with an openness she didn't carry indoors, running her hands along the crusted tops of the fence posts, lying down in the white field behind the house and making shapes with her arms, calling Sable out onto the back porch and watching him pick his way fastidiously through the drifts near the steps with the dignified confusion of a creature deeply skeptical of precipitation. There was laughter during those weeks. Real, unconsidered laughter. Adeline watched her daughter and the cat in the snow and felt something ease in her chest, some accumulation of quiet worry dissolving slightly into the cold air. She did not know what was coming. She thought, not for the first time, that the worst was behind them. She was almost right. The storm that changed everything arrived in January. Ren was 5.5. The storm came in the night, announced by no preliminary weather system that anyone had tracked with any certainty, building fast over the ridge and driving hard across the fields by midnight. It was the kind of storm that feels personal. It feels like it has chosen the specific house it intends to unsettle. Adeline woke to the sound of it at 12:30. She lay in the dark for a moment, listening. Heavy rain, real wind. The trees at the field edge doing something violent and rhythmic. Thunder still in the distance, but moving closer, unmistakable. She got up to check on Ren. The hall was dark. She didn't turn on the light. She had walked this hall in the dark enough times that the distances were in her body. She opened Ren's door. The room was lit by the faint gray light that came through the curtains on storm nights, that particular luminosity of a sky lit from within. She could see the bed. She could see Ren's shape in it. She could see Sable. He was not in his usual position. He was sitting at the very foot of the bed, facing the door, facing her, his amber eyes catching the gray light. And there was something about how he was sitting, something Adeline could not articulate except to say that it felt like being met, like arriving somewhere and finding that whatever you needed was already there, already turned toward you, already waiting. She crossed the room. She sat on the edge of the bed. Wren was awake, she realized, not speaking, not hiding, just awake, lying on her side with her eyes open, watching Sable. The thunder came then. The real thunder, the kind that doesn't announce itself with a rumble first, just arrives. And the room went white, and the sound filled everything, and Adeline felt it in her back teeth. Wren did not flinch. She said, in that low, quiet voice that she used sometimes when she was saying something that was very serious to her, that she remembered. Adeline went very still. She said she knew why the storms felt wrong. She said it felt like the night Daddy left. She said she had always remembered, but that she hadn't known how to say it. Adeline understood then, for the first time fully, what the fear had been. Not just the argument, not just the departure. She was thinking about what Wren would have seen from the top of the stairs that night, that small silhouette she had glimpsed before her own voice went quiet. The sight of two adults in a kitchen during a storm, one of them reaching for his keys from the hook by the door. She said, as gently and as honestly as she could, that she was sorry. That she was sorry Wren had seen that. That she was sorry the night had felt the way it did. That what happened was not Wren's fault, was not caused by anything Wren had done or said or been. Wren looked at her for a long time. Then she looked at Sable. She said that Sable knew. She said he had always come to her before the storm, because he knew she would remember, and he didn't want her to remember alone. The thunder rolled again, and the rain intensified against the glass, and Adeline sat on the edge of her daughter's bed in the gray stormlight and did not try to respond to this, because there was no response that did not diminish it. She reached out and put her hand on Wren's cheek, and Wren closed her eyes for a moment, and Sable came forward from the foot of the bed and settled beside Wren and made that sound. Low, sustained, present. Adeline sat with them until the storm passed. She did not sleep. She sat in the dark with her daughter and the cat and the sound of the rain, and she thought about the years that had passed and the weight that had lived in this house and the things that had gone, unnamed for too long, and she made a quiet and irrevocable decision about the kind of honesty she owed her daughter going forward. When the last of the thunder had moved off and the rain had softened to something closer to silence, Wren was asleep. Sable was curled beside her. The room had settled into that particular peace that exists only after a storm, when the air is clean and the sounds are small, and the world has returned to something that feels manageable. Adeline stood up and looked at the cat for a long moment. He looked back at her, those amber eyes, unhurried, steady, uncategorizable. She reached out and touched the top of his head briefly. He did not move. Then she went back to her room, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she cried. Not the measured, controlled grief of a woman managing, but the real kind. The kind that has been banked and compressed for so long that when it finally comes, it comes with its full original weight. She cried for the night Callum left. She cried for the argument and the rain and the small shape at the top of the stairs. She cried for the silence and the fear and the years of not knowing what to name what lived inside her daughter's gray eyes. She cried for Lenora keeping the secret of Callum's contact because she understood now why she had kept it. And she cried because of what a 5-year-old child had just told her in the dark. The thing that had been living in Wren since that night, all that time, quiet and heavy and waiting. By the time she was finished, the house was fully still. There are moments in a family's life that act as hinge points. Everything before and everything after. What happened over the following months in the house on Ember Creek Road would be described by anyone watching from outside as ordinary, a child in therapy, learning the language for what she carried, a mother making a phone call that had been overdue, a grandmother sitting at a kitchen table, hands around a mug, finally saying the things she should have said sooner, a man driving up a ridge road he had not driven in 2.5 years, sitting in a parked car at the end of the driveway for a long time before getting out, ordinary and not ordinary at all. Callum came on a Saturday in March. The air smelled of the particular sharpness that precedes spring in hill country, half ice and half the memory of growing things. Wren knew he was coming. Adeline had told her clearly, without editing, and Wren had listened with her habitual stillness, and then said she wanted to meet him, and that Sable should be allowed to stay. This last condition was delivered with the seriousness of someone establishing a term, not making a request. Adeline had agreed. He looked thinner. He looked as though he had been somewhere very interior, and had made the difficult climb back out. He stood on the porch and looked at his daughter, and Adeline could not see his face from where she was standing, but she could see his hands, both of them against his sides, very still, the stillness of someone concentrating very hard on not falling apart. Wren stood in the open door with Sable beside her, not quite in front of her, not hiding behind her, just beside her, the way he always stood when the world required steadiness. She looked at Callum for a long moment. He looked at her. Then she said, simply and without preamble, that she remembered the storm. He made a sound, not a word, something that came from below words. He put one hand over his face, and then took it away and nodded. She stepped out onto the porch and stood in front of him and looked up at him with those gray eyes, clear and direct as water over stone. She said she wasn't angry. She said she had been afraid for a long time, but that she was less afraid now. He crouched down until he was at her level, and she studied his face the way she studied everything, with that complete and unhurried attention. And then she leaned forward and put her arms around his neck, and his arms came up around her, and Adeline, watching from the doorway, looked at the sky above the ridge and breathed. Sable sat on the porch step beside them, tail curled around his paws, face turned slightly away, as though offering them privacy. There is a thing about grief that most people learn too late. It does not travel in a straight line toward resolution. It circles, it doubles back, it visits you in weather. It finds you when you are quiet, in rooms where old things live, in the smell of certain seasons, in the sound of rain on particular windows. The year that followed Callum's return was not a year of easy restoration. It was not a movie version of repair. Adeline and Callum were not the same people who had stood in that kitchen during that storm. They had each become someone new in the years between, and the work of learning each other again, of deciding what was possible and what was not, was slow and imperfect and sometimes painful. But they did the work. That was the thing. They did the actual work. Wren's therapist, a calm and perceptive woman named Dr. Solano, told Adeline at the end of their first year of sessions that Wren had made remarkable progress. She said that children who have a stable attachment figure during periods of high anxiety often emerge with significant emotional resources, and that the quality of Wren's attachment had been clear from early in their work. She mentioned Sable, somewhat to Adeline's surprise. Wren had described the cat in detail, she said. She had described what he did during storms. She had described it as the thing that helped her learn that fear could be stayed inside rather than fled from. She had used the word taught. Adeline had driven home from that appointment thinking about the February night Sable had walked through the door, thinking about the unremarkable decision to open the door, thinking about all the things that follow from single small choices. Sable was 6 years old when the last storm came. 6 years in cat time has a different quality than 6 years in human time. But Adeline had noticed over the past several months that something in him had shifted. He slept more. He was less quick to rise. The amber eyes were the same, deep and direct, but there was something in his movements that had acquired the careful quality of age, that slight deliberateness that speaks of a body conserving what it has. She said nothing about this to anyone. She watched. The last storm came in October, 5 years after the night of his arrival in February. Wren was 10 years old that month. She had changed in every measurable way, and also in ways that couldn't be measured. She was taller. Her hair had darkened from the pale blonde of early childhood to something closer to amber, which Callum said matched her eyes in certain light. She spoke more easily now, not because she had become someone else, but because the fear that had pressed against words had loosened its grip. She laughed more. She had a best friend at school, a girl named Petra, who shared her habit of precise observation and her preference for the outdoors. She still had Sable. She still sat with him on the back porch step in the mornings before school. She still rested her hand on his back with that particular lightness, that quality of connection that needed no pressure to be real. The October storm came in the early evening, while dinner was still on the table. It was a significant storm, the kind that reaches everywhere, that presses into every room and against every window simultaneously, that makes the house feel both sheltered and very small. Sable stood up from his place by the back door. He moved differently now. The same purpose, the same direction, but slower, with a heaviness that was not fear. He crossed the kitchen and went through the hall and began the stairs. Wren was already up. She met him at the top of the stairs, as though she had felt him coming, or had been waiting, or as though the years of watching this pattern had built something between them that worked through walls and floors and the ordinary distances between rooms. She sat down on the landing. He climbed the last step and settled beside her, and she put her arms around him, not tightly, gently, and pressed her face into the top of his head. The storm hit the house then, the full weight of it, rain like something solid against the roof, thunder that arrived without courtesy, lightning that lit the hall in a pulse of absolute clarity. Adeline, standing at the bottom of the stairs, watched her daughter and the cat on the landing above her. Wren was not afraid. She was not afraid in the way of someone suppressing fear. She was not afraid in the way of someone white-knuckling through. She was simply not afraid. She sat on the landing in the pulse of thunder and lightning with her face in Sable's fur, and she was completely still and completely present, and her breathing was slow, and her face, when the lightning lit it, was peaceful in a way that made Adeline's throat close. She said his name, just his name, once. And then she said something else, very quietly, in a voice that Adeline almost didn't catch over the sound of the rain. She said she thought he had been waiting until he knew she didn't need him that way anymore. Adeline came up the stairs and sat beside them both on the landing, and the three of them sat there together in the storm. And outside the rain made the world invisible, and inside the house everything was accounted for and close. Sable died on a quiet day in November. No storm. Still air, thin November sunlight, the fields pale and empty, the house at rest. He went to his place by the back door, as he always did in the morning, and Wren sat with him there, and he simply went to sleep. She did not move. She sat with her hand on his side until Adeline came and found them. Lenora, when she heard, sat down at the kitchen table and did not say anything for a long time. Then she said that she was not a person who believed in things she couldn't explain. She said she had spent her whole life managing things that had explanations. Then she said quietly that she believed Sable had known something, that she believed he had arrived for a reason and stayed for a reason, and that the reason had been Wren. She said she did not know what to call that. She said she was not sure a name for it existed that was adequate. Adeline thought about the February night he arrived, the water bowl in the corner, the sound of Wren's laughter from upstairs. She thought about the notes she had made that summer, the averages, the 32 minutes. She thought about the sound he had made, low and sustained and impossible to categorize. She thought about the storm landing and Wren not hiding. She thought about the landing and October and a 10-year-old girl in the lightning. She did not say any of this. She sat at the table with her mother, and they drank their tea, and the house was quiet around them, the way houses are quiet that have held a great deal and released some of it. They buried Sable at the edge of the field, near the fence post where the deer sometimes passed in the early mornings. Wren chose the spot. Callum dug the grave, and Lenara brought flowers from the garden, dried November things, brown and gold and persistent. They stood around the small mound in the cold, and Wren said a few things that she had written on a piece of paper, very short, very direct. She said that Sable had come to her every time it stormed and had never left her alone during the hard parts. She said she used to think storms were the night her father left and that she had been afraid of them ever since. She said that Sable had sat with her during all of it, every storm for 6 years, until she understood that the storms were not the leaving. They were just weather. They were just noise and water and the world doing what it does. She said that he had taught her the difference. Then she folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket, and she stood at the small grave in the cold November light with her family around her, and after a moment she reached out and took her father's hand. Callum, who had been looking at the ground, looked up. He held his daughter's hand. The wind came across the field from the tree line and moved the dried grass and lifted some of the petals from the flowers. Lenora had brought and scattered them across the dark earth. None of them moved for a long time. There is a particular kind of story that does not belong entirely to the category of the explainable and does not belong entirely to the category of the miraculous, but lives in the narrow passage between them. In that passage, you find the things that science can almost name, that logic can nearly reach, but that emotion insists on understanding differently. Sable was a cat, an animal with barometric sensitivity and a territorial attachment to a child who needed him. If you required an explanation, that is a sufficient one. It is also true that he arrived in February after Callum left, in the specific gap in that family's architecture where something essential was missing. That he found Wren first, before he found any other room or person in the house. That he sat with her through 61 storms over 6 years. That he came to her on the landing in October, slower and heavier, and stayed through the last significant storm of his life. That he died in stillness on a quiet day, his side warm under Wren's hand, in a house that had learned, at last, to hold its grief instead of bury it. If you required meaning, that is also sufficient. Wren kept the piece of paper she had folded at the graveside. She kept it in a small wooden box that had belonged to Lenara and had been given to her for her 11th birthday. Inside the box, over the years, she put a few other things. A photograph of the back porch step on a snowy day, Sable's outline dark against the white. A dried flower from Lenora's November arrangement. And the notes her mother had made that first summer, the careful observations, the 32 minutes written in blue pen. She took the box with her when she left for college 7 years later, wrapped in a sweater in the middle of her suitcase, tucked between the ordinary and necessary things. She took it because some things should not be left behind. Because some things are the reason you learned how to stay. Because he came to her when the sky went dark, and he stayed with her until it cleared. Because he listened for the thing that came before the noise, and he sat with her in it, and he did not leave. Because when the last storm came, she was no longer afraid. And that is, finally, what a miracle looks like when it lives inside an ordinary life. Not a flash of light, not a voice from somewhere beyond the ceiling. Just a small black cat with amber eyes, arriving at the door in February, walking through it without hesitation, climbing the stairs to the room where someone needed him, and staying there, through the rain, through the noise. through all the years of weather, staying there